In this lecture, I want to establish the foundations of behavioristic psychology in the 20th century, and I should begin by saying a few words about the father, the so-called father of experimental psychology, at least in modern times, and that's Wilhelm Wundt, who in 1879 at the University of Leipzig established what is regarded as the first laboratory devoted exclusively to research on psychological problems. Now, this is a controversial claim, and historians of psychology are always careful when it comes to questions of priority. America's own great William James certainly can make a claim to have established a research facility for psychological work at Harvard even before 1879. The credit, I think, goes to Wundt for more reasons than the reason of chronology. Wundt not only established a laboratory at Leipzig, he established a journal in which the productions of that laboratory could be published. He became the focus, the nexus, for students of the subject to come to Leipzig, learn about the subject, do research, publish their findings, earn advanced degrees, and in fact proceed to populate departments all over the world, including the United States. It became customary, not only in psychology, but in all subjects, for universities to look to Germany in the second half of the 19th century for their faculties. It was the German model of doctoral education that came to be the dominant model, doctoral education being highly specialized, subject-oriented, to some extent even professionalized. And to this day, doctoral education around the world bears that mark. There are assets and liabilities that go along with a model of that kind. Wundt was also influential on the basis of his sheer breadth of knowledge and erudition. He did a two-volume logic text that was a leading text in its field. He wrote a biography of Leibniz. He wrote introductory lectures in human and animal psychology, a textbook which he titled Physiological Psychology. The man's reach in anthropological, physiological, experimental, logical subjects was extraordinary. His productivity was extraordinary, scarcely matched in the history of psychology. The complete works of Freud, of course, would compare favorably with the complete works of Wundt, but Wundt's range is almost incredible, and his output quite prodigious. Now, I sometimes find it important to distinguish between what in other contexts I've referred to as Wundt's Agenda A and Wundt's Agenda B. The Wundt we revere, the Wundt who in 1979, the centennial of the founding of the Leipzig Laboratory, was the subject of addresses at every major psychology conference in the world. That Wundt, the constant source of citations and the like, is the Wundt of experimental psychology. But there is another Wundt, the Wundt of Agenda B, who late in his career wrote a multi-volume work titled Völkerpsychologie, not so much a folk psychology as an anthropological psychology, in which he sets forth a program for understanding human life within complex social contexts. Now, that part of the Wundt program, until quite recently, has been more or less ignored, viewed by many to be such a soft science as not to be worthy of a scientific psychology. But Wundt was imaginative and educated enough to recognize that the laboratory, though a very, very important place to understand basic processes, couldn't be a less aptly chosen place to understand the complexities of human social interaction and the influence of culture on the human condition and on human psychology at large. So I might from time to time seem to be presenting a Wundtian psychology obeisant only to Agenda A. Keep in mind that Agenda B was always in the background of Wundt's own thinking. Now, the method that was to be employed in the Leipzig laboratory is sometimes referred to as the introspective method, though Wundt's methods went well beyond that. There were experiments at Leipzig involving reaction time, the complication experiments, where, for example, something having a trajectory would be released, and the subject's task is to hit a key at the point where he thinks a point on that trajectory will be reached. A reaction time experiment in which the subject is told to respond as quickly as he can when a light is presented, but then the subject is to respond either with the left hand or the right hand, depending on whether it's a red or a green light. Now, as you increase the number of alternatives that the percipient has to deal with, you discover that there are systematic increases in the amount of time it takes. The idea here being that for every decision that has to be made, brain processes of an ever more complex nature must be engaged, and with reaction time data, you actually can infer plausibly the amount of time taken within the nervous system to process this sort of information. We are now in the midst of something called the neurocognitive revolution, and I should tell you much of the research done, even before the end of the 19th century, in Wundt's laboratory at Leipzig, anticipates much of what now goes on in the areas of information processing, neurocognitive function, and the like. So Wundt's Agenda A for a systematic experimental psychology remains a rich source of inspiration, and to some extent even a rich source of information that still informs as the 20th century comes to a close. The idea that Wundt's method or methodology, as people painfully say, was introspective, I think comes by way of one of his most famous students, E.B. Titchener, who was invited to Cornell University to establish one of America's first experimental psychology programs and departments at Cornell University. Titchener became something of the official disciple, prophet, interpreter, exegete of the Wundtian psychology. Titchener and Titchener's wife saw fit to have any number of Wundt's German works translated into English. The English-speaking world came to regard Titchener's writings as authoritative writings on Wundt's own psychology. This is a long and complex chapter in the history of psychology. Let me just say, by way of a short script, that Titchener is not an entirely reliable interpreter of Wundt, and the Titchenerian Wundt is somewhat different from the Wundtian Wundt. This has all been made much clearer in the past 20 or 30 years of quite serious Wundt scholarship. Well, let me just say then that, that to some extent what Titchener did extract from the Leipzig years and from his close association with Wundt was a recognition that the subject matter of psychology is the subject of conscious life, and more particularly the contents of consciousness. That what a systematic and scientific psychology should be concerning itself with is what goes on in the mind. But to do this experimentally, the mind has to be broken down into more elementary processes. It must be, as we would say in the late 20th century, modularized. You have to take a look at mental life as it is influenced by sensations. You must examine mental life as it might be influenced by memory. You must examine mental life as it is influenced by emotion. And so the Titchenerian program, which is sometimes referred to as structuralism, the Titchenerian program, often defended as an authentic representation of what Wundt's psychology is all about, though again, it isn't quite that authentic a representation. The Titchenerian structuralist program says this: a scientific psychology begins the way biology begins. You begin by laying out the anatomy of your subject, which is to say the structure of the mind. And to a first approximation, the structure of the mind consists of sensations, images, and feelings. The research program then involves an examination of sensory processes, memorial processes, affective or emotional processes, and the laws that shape and guide the interaction between and among these three foundational elements of conscious life and mental life. Well, how do you do things like this? In the Titchenerian study, you'd have these subjects closeted up there in Ithaca, New York, probably during very, very cold winter days, in dark rooms, being presented with lights, and asked to introspect on the sensations or the feelings that they would have. You needed, Titchener constantly reminded us, you needed the trained introspectionist. You needed someone who would not, for example, be guided by the physical properties of the stimulus, but could tell you faithfully how that particular stimulus influenced him as a subject. When you hear, for example, that psychologists back in 1900 were studying colored lights and their affective tone, that red lights have a kind of warming feeling that they encourage, that blue light is a cold light, that green is restful. Well, of course, this is stock introspectionist psychology of the Tichnerian sort. If, in fact, it is the case that colors conduce to certain feelings, then how might people come to judge things when their emotions have been influenced by the color of the ambient world? Or how might they judge a stimulus as you change its color? Well, this was part of the structuralist psychology of Titchener. You can do any number of experiments of this sort. You can sit down tractable college sophomores the world over, usually as volunteers, sometimes for course credit, though I don't think that's a very good thing to do, occasionally for a few quid for every hour that they log. You can flash all sorts of stimulus at their eyes or play things in through headphones, and you can get them introspectively to tell you that something seems to be warm, or it's a cause of mirth, or that's music that strikes melancholy chords within me. And I say the handbook that you will be able to compile doing research of this kind will be thicker than the New York City Yellow Pages. There's no question about that. Now, in America at the time, there was to some extent a complementary but also a competing perspective. It's one that we most closely associate with the name William James. William James is the subject of several massive biographies, and I can say with some confidence that he has eluded the pages of all of them, though they are wonderful and estimable biographies. This is a man of great intellectual complexity, a philosopher, a psychologist, a physiologist. I'm a great fan of Henry James. I'm inclined to say William James perhaps is the best writer in that family, a great stylist. His Principles of Psychology must be the most interesting textbook ever written, and it's certainly the most interesting textbook ever written in psychology. He started out in life, he was interested in becoming an artist. He grew up in that famous James household, a father and grandfather, a grandfather who had accumulated great wealth, a father who was interested in Swedenborg and all sorts of peculiarities drawn from intellectual and philosophical history. The conversations at table were wide-ranging and deep. The boys and the sister from the earliest time became colloquists in this ongoing family discussion of what really matters. But James, with all this going on, and Swedenborgian influences, and European scholarship, and the Lake poets and all that, James surfaces as the quintessential New England American intellectual. At the end of the day, he's concerned with what finally has practical consequences in the world. At the end of the day, theory has to yield to the ordinary facts available to common perception and common sense. William James's famous pragmatic philosophy is, I say, a quintessentially American philosophy. It's a let's get on with it. It's let's not foreclose our options. Let's oppose everything, to use William James's expression, let's oppose anything that presents itself as the so-called block universe, the last word on what really is, the final laws, the ultimate cement and glue of the universe. No further inquiry needed. We now understand this. All of this is what James opposes. And what he offers in its place is what he calls a radical empiricism. Any fact of experience that is coextensive with human life has as much validity as any other experience. If religious experiences are at the foundation of significant human activities and achievements, then the religious experience, the transcendental experience, must figure in any developed and scientific psychology. Nothing that occurs with regularity and salience in the human condition is to be ruled out a priori. James was far less interested in the structure of consciousness. He had certain doubts about the very concept of consciousness itself. He was much less interested in the Tichnerian structure of consciousness than he was interested in the functions served by mental life. What is consciousness for? After all, says James, all of the adaptive behavior that the Darwinian biology requires could be engaged in by organisms that have no consciousness whatever. You could have Cartesian sort of robotic, that wouldn't have been his term, so toys of one sort or another, complex machinery that could acquire sufficient food to nourish themselves and walk out of the cold and toward a warm place. All of this could go on without any consciousness whatever. In fact, there may be successful species with quite limited conscious life. So the question we must ask ourselves within a larger Darwinian framework, since we are conscious mental beings, what functions are served by this? What is it we can achieve this way that could not be achieved otherwise? And in his Principles of Psychology, he offers some candidate answers to that question. One that I find particularly summoning, even amusing at a certain level, is this. He says, well, take a look at the human nervous system. And he had an expert knowledge of it for his time. He had studied medicine, and he had studied physiology in great depth, and he taught it at Harvard. The human brain, he says, is a hair-trigger device. Its complexity is so great that it would be shooting off half-cocked moment to moment. The thing couldn't be controlled at all. Consciousness, as we call it, or this mental life, seems to be a means by which the activity of the brain itself becomes coordinated and coherent and organized. Now, he's not coming across as some Cartesian dualist, you know, with his mind sort of separated from the body and sitting above it, perhaps sausage-shaped or a little oval disc or a tongue of fire or whatever. But he is granting ontological status to a mental life that must have some regulative function. Our consciousness, our attentive processes, our capacity not simply to sit back and passively be stimulated by an external world, but to select items within that world, to bring our attention to bear on something, to have the power of focusing on something, the power of selection, which is at the center of so much of Jamesian psychology. Here we have an active psychology, a psychology of an active mind, the stream of consciousness that brings us into and out of reveries, that has one thought proceed upon another and another and another. And in that stream of consciousness, we find at once our identity and our shifting purposes and plans. And we track our way through a busy, complex, and often befuddling world. The Jamesian psychology will not produce Jamesian psychologists. You can't get a school out of something like this. It's too open-textured. It's too open to possibilities currently not envisionable, do you see? And at the same time, it is an optimistic, pragmatic psychology that says, here is an adaptive, resourceful organism. Over the long haul, it will do better what it now does not do very well. The future is open to us. We have to keep our eye on the ball. We don't have to saddle ourselves with limiting theories. We should take our experiences as we find them. They are not under some burden to justify themselves. An experience carries with it its own warrants, so to speak. So here is a functionalist psychology that already is a prelude to behaviorism. It's already a prelude to a psychology that concerns itself with how creatures actually function in the world, adapt to the demands of the world, proceed to change the world. It's not surprising that behaviorism would be a uniquely American creation within psychology. As Europe is found at the time still steeped in controversial theoretical issues about the structure of consciousness and whether introspective reports are reliable and whether yellow light imposes this or that kind of affective tone. As all this is going on, there is a first quiet, then not so quiet movement within American psychology that's becoming increasingly impatient with this, deriving some strength from James's influence. These forces, I think, converge on one of the most interesting figures in the modern history of psychology, and that's John B. Watson, who is routinely declared to be the father of American behaviorism. Watson is at the University of Chicago getting his PhD. He's at Chicago during the period in which Dewey is having such a great influence on intellectual life in America. There's not much evidence to suggest that Watson was particularly influenced by Dewey. He's at Chicago during a time when William James also will show up there to give a series of lectures. I don't think you actually had to listen to William James to be influenced by him. His writings were so influential. Watson is, to a very considerable extent, his own man. He sees what the structuralists have been doing up at Cornell. He's read William James and so-called functionalist psychology. He will tell us in his first book that he can't find a dime's difference between them. He recognizes that the Tichnerian program at Cornell, with the trained introspectionist reflecting on feelings that they have when lights are flashed and so forth, this will go nowhere. You can do these experiments until planet Earth suffers the heat death, and all you will have is an ever-growing and ever thicker and thicker handbook of disconnected findings on something that has no relevance to daily life at all. Watson will tell us in his first book that the question you ask about a science, and here you can see James's pragmatism being influential, but it's also part of the American ethos. The question you ask about a science is this: if it has really told us something worth knowing, we ought to be able to do something which before that scientific achievement we couldn't do. Ask yourself, under the great weight of the Wundtian program, Titchener's program and the like, what psychology now can tell us, can allow us to do that couldn't have been done before? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Watson wants to argue that the mistake was made right at the outset. We didn't have the right subject matter. If you want to develop a science, then like every other science, your subject matter has to pass at least this test. Is it observable? Are you studying something that presents itself to public scrutiny? Or is it something inevitably tied up in the private life or the private machinations of an individual mind? Now, Watson says there is something that's publicly observable that works perfectly as a subject matter for psychology. Behavior. The behavior of organisms. And so, in a book titled Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist, Watson lays down the gauntlet. He challenges psychologists the world over to come up with as worthy a subject matter. He challenges psychologists the world over to defend a mentalistic science against this very practical, pragmatic psychology of behavior, science of behavior. Now, the theory available to Watson as he was developing his ideas in the first decade of the 20th century, the theory that came along usefully was Pavlov's. Watson was not a pushover when it came to these highly physiological theories, but he found in Pavlov's model of classical conditioning just the sort of thing he needed as a way of explaining how associations are formed in organisms, and therefore how behavior comes to be shaped. He was tied, that is, very much to the Pavlovian classical conditioning model. He also recognized that if there is to be a behavioral science, a science based on the actual activity of organisms in the world, the nature-nurture issue will have to be addressed and, to all possible extents, settled. Are we to assume that most of what is within us by way of psychology is innate? And Watson's answer to this is, that's an experimental question. That's an empirical question. You don't sit in the armchair and try to get an answer to this. You actually go out and test it. Well, he gets himself a position at Johns Hopkins after the PhD is earned. Why? Because Johns Hopkins has a very, very famous baby clinic, and he wants to see what kind of psychological equipment infants come into the world with. This is what a good scientific experimental psychologist does on a question like the nature-nurture question. He's ably assisted in his research by Mrs. Rayner, after whose divorce she will emerge as John Watson's wife. Something of a scandal surrounding this, and it had much to do with Watson leaving Johns Hopkins. I should tell you that he subsequently went into advertising. He amassed quite an estate and quite a fortune. They were apparently blissfully married for many, many, many years. But at the time, at Johns Hopkins, I'm sure the Board of Governors could not possibly be pleased by this liaison and this merging of science and romance. Well, with Mrs. Rayner's assistance, Watson proceeds to study and describe the results of the study of infants. And he tells us, now, if you want to see what infants come into the world with, one way of doing this is you go into the baby clinic at night while the infants are all asleep. A dark nursery, do you see? You pick out any baby you like at random. It doesn't matter which one. Just go over to the crib, tiptoe over very, very quietly, reach in, pick up the baby, and throw it up in the air. Now, if you do this, he says, you'll discover that every time the baby will flex in a dorsal plane, dorsiflexion, and the eyes will open quite wide, and the mouth will be ovaled, and there will be breath holding on inspiration. And this whole pattern of behavior is the primordium of the emotion of fear. You'll get that in every baby. You'll get it first time out of the gate. This is not something that requires learning or practice or anything else. So you can put that in the score one for the nativists, the instinctivists and the like. You've got that. All right. Now you can go back into the baby clinic when the babies have been hungry for a while and they're all soaking in their own products of digestion and the like, and they're quite ornery. Now you pick one up and clean it off and wash it down and give it some talc and put on a new diaper and have a bit of milk of just the right temperature and pick the baby up and give the baby the bottle, and you'll discover that the baby is very, very relaxed. The eyes are not open or squeezed shut, but sort of gently closed, and you might hang on to your laboratory jacket. I thought that was a nice touch when Watson mentioned that. And soft breathing. And here you have the primordium of an affectionate bond or love. This will be foundational for the emotion of love. And then yet on another occasion, you can go in while the babies are taking nutriment and just tear the bottle out of the baby's mouth. And when you do this, you find that the baby flexes in the ventral direction, and the eyes are not ovaled or gently closed, but squeezed shut, and air is forced out on expiration. You get that sort of thing, do you see? And this is the primordium of rage. The primordium. Now, Watson wants to argue that the full personality development involves the merging and melding of these three basic instinctual emotional patterns. But except for this foundational sort of temperamental, instinctual core, the balance of the story is written by actual experience, by conditioning of a Pavlovian nature. Watson, at the end of the book, issues a summons to the mothers of the world. I'm not quite sure that editors would let this pass just this way today, but he says, mothers of the world, tell us what you want. Doctor, lawyer, butcher, baker. And through conditioning techniques, a scientific behavioristic psychology will be able to return to you children now so inclined in that direction as inevitably to fulfill the prescription. A behavioral science will give you the behavior you want. Now, Watson was an extremely effective writer. He's sort of in the period just before and including H.L. Mencken, you know, very great stylists, polemical writing, attention-getting types of essays. Watson was quite good at this. When he left Johns Hopkins, he would write newspaper articles, advice to mothers, and so forth. There was a debate held in Constitution Hall, in DAR, Constitution Hall in Washington, between him and McDougall, who was the famous instinctivist psychologist at the time. The papers reported the next day that although Dr. McDougall had the better argument, Dr. Watson won over the hearts of all the women in the audience. Watson was a quite striking, sort of 1930s type, square jaw, gray hair, business suit, someone you can trust and believe in. Well, of course, the proposition that the way you get doctors or dentists and the like is by putting somebody in a Pavlov frame, bell food, this was not convincing. But the polemical part worked. A practical, scientific, technical psychology is a behavioral psychology, and behaviorism now is on the map of psychological thought to be picked up by Skinner and turned into one of the most influential schools of psychology. I should say with Freud's psychoanalytic theory, one of the two most influential schools of psychology throughout the second half of the 20th century, and only recently eclipsed. It starts with Wundt in his laboratory. William James functionalizes it. Watson, in his impatience, behavioralizes it, and we get very close to modern and contemporary psychology.